In this module, I want to cover the techniques used to apply insecticides and miticides for management of landscape insects and mites. In the past, most of the applications were made by spraying insecticides in a water emulsion, suspension, or solution directly onto the plants. Some companies specialized in spraying of tall trees and high-pressure sprayers, but this has declined with new rules and regulations concerning drift of pesticides onto other locations. With the registration of numerous systemic insecticides, many applications are now made by injecting the insecticides directly into the plant or into the soil where roots pick up the pesticide and transport it throughout the plant. Some pesticides even allow for drenching of the soil. As you can see, there are a lot of different options that can be used to apply insecticides and miticides. Not all methods are used by all landscape managers. Small backpack and hand can sprayers are convenient for treating individual plants in a landscape. Mist blowers are still available, but they are rarely used because of the perceived risk of drift onto adjacent properties. Some of the larger companies use trucks with large tanks with pumps that can deliver low-pressure sprays to landscape plants. This allows the technician to visit many properties in a single day. A few companies still have some tall tree sprayers, which are high-pressure units that can deliver sprays 20 to 30 feet in the air. These are used sparingly because of regulations governing drift of sprays onto adjacent properties. Spreaders are rarely used by landscape managers except for turf applications. However, some rotary handheld devices are used to spread granules into flower beds. Many systems have been developed for directly injecting insecticides into the vascular systems of plants. Many of these require company training before you can use the products. Some pesticides also allow trunk sprays or soil drenches or soil injections. The smallest equipment used to apply sprays to turf and ornamental plants are hand cans and backpack sprayers. Both use hand pump systems to create pressure to deliver the sprays. Hand cans are usually 1 to 2 gallons in size and are normally used to spot spray weeds in turf or spray single ornamental plants. These are ideal for targeted IPM treatments. Backpack sprayers usually contain 3 to 5 gallons of spray. Thus, these can spray larger areas. These pieces of equipment are very difficult to accurately calibrate, so a pressure gauge and clicker may be needed to determine their flow rate over time. For ornamental plants, sprays are made until beginning of runoff to ensure even coverage. Remember, if you have insects or mites that live on leaf undersurfaces, the spray wand may have to be turned upward to contact these surfaces from below. Mist blowers are usually backpack types. These can hold 2 to 5 gallons of concentrated spray mix. They have a motor that produces a strong and steady jet of air. The pesticide mix is dripped into the air stream, which immediately forms a mist that can be blown 5 to 15 feet. These are especially effective for reaching leaf undersurfaces, but care has to be taken to take time to get thorough coverage. Mist blowers are losing favor because of the motor noise and the risk of having the mist drift onto adjacent properties. Many of the larger landscape management companies obtain trucks that hold 300 to 500 gallon tanks. These are connected to a pumping system that can deliver several gallons per minute at relatively low pressures, something below 40 psi. These systems utilize long hoses that can reach to the back of the customer's yards from the street. Spray nozzles usually deliver relatively coarse sprays so as to avoid making mist that can drift onto adjacent properties. I'm not a real fan of these systems because companies that use them generally spray all of the trees, shrubs, and flowers at the same time, which is definitely not an IPM approach. Most of the large tree care companies in the past prominently advertised that they had these big trucks with high-pressure sprayers that could reach the top of large trees. These usually operate at 500 to 700 psi and deliver 20 to 40 gallons of spray per minute. While there are still companies that have these types of equipment, rules and regulations governing drift onto adjacent properties has made the use of these sprayers difficult and fraught with liabilities. In any case, they are still great pieces of equipment for treating large trees with contact insecticides or dormant oil sprays. As you can see from these distributor advertising images, these can treat pretty tall trees, but I see lots of spray mist drifting away. Small drop spreaders are most commonly used on lawns. Most of these units are 18 to 24 inches wide, though there are some 3 to 5 foot wide units. Drop spreaders are very precise once calibrated. The problem with drop spreaders is that there is very little tolerance for overlapping or not overlapping an application. As you can see in the image where the fertilizer was applied to a lawn with a drop spreader, the person spreading the fertilizer didn't overlap the edges precisely. These kinds of spreaders are occasionally used to spread fertilizer to commercial scale flower beds before the plants are installed. Rotary spreaders are also generally preferred by lawn care companies. Such spreaders hold granules in a hopper which drops the granules onto a rotating plate which flings the granules out in an arc. The arc is usually 5 to 8 foot wide with the edges being feathered. This allows for more flexibility in overlapping spreads back and forth and avoid missing strips of treated surfaces. The problem with granules is that they can be flung onto sidewalks and driveways where they have to be swept off. Some units have side shields that can be raised or lowered to limit granules on one side or another. Again, these are rarely used in landscape trees, shrubs, or flower beds, but they can be useful in spreading systemic granules under individual trees in a landscape or flinging granules into flower beds. Instead of using a wheeled rotary spreader, there are smaller units that hold a pound or two of granules, and these are either handheld or have slings that run around the applicator's neck or shoulder. In the industry, these are often called belly grinders. These can be useful for spreading granules into flower beds or under solitary trees or shrubs that may be located in a landscape. Handheld sprayers, backpacks, and mist blowers are very difficult to calibrate so that you follow the label instructions and not exceed stated limits. There are methods for roughly making calibrations, but they are not nearly as easy as calibrating a boom sprayer that is used in some of the larger turf applications and agricultural crops. Spreader calibration is a more detailed process and requires a fairly complicated setup that includes pans to capture granules as one walks the spreader at a given speed and drop rate. This will require a large flat surface such as a driveway or parking lot. Most homeowners who use these spreaders simply set the unit on whatever setting is mentioned on the product's label, and they don't pay much attention to walking speed. Of course, a person walking half the speed of another person will apply twice as much material per unit area. AceCap technology uses small plastic implants that are inserted into holes drilled into the trunks of trees. The systemic insecticide is released and picked up by the tree's vascular system and transported upward. Obviously, what is protected by this kind of treatment is always above the implant level. In other words, such treatments don't move downward if you have borers in the roots or root flare area. Some suggest using these kinds of implants sparingly, as the holes are about a half an inch in diameter, and not all trees heal over these wounds rapidly. There are several systems that are called micro-injectors. Borejet and TreeTech are two of these types. Small holes are drilled into the cambium of a tree. The plastic nozzles are inserted into the holes and the ends are pressed so as to pressurize their contents. All of these systems require that you stay until the pesticide is taken up so that someone else doesn't accidentally expose themselves to the products. Arbor Systems Company has developed several hypodermic needle type injectors. The most common handheld ones use a pesticide or fertilizer canister that is screwed onto the applicator device. The device has two arms, which, when pulled, forces the liquid through a large gauge needle and into the tree tissues. This company has larger devices that don't need the hand pressure to operate. Borejet has a pressure system that involves drilling holes around a tree to be treated. These are then hooked up with tubing and injected with various products. This is a relatively expensive kit to purchase, and you will need training to use it effectively and correctly. It has a proven track record for control of several insect borers like the emerald ash borer. There are some other companies that have developed similar systems. There are dozens of companies that have developed smaller self-contained units that are capable of injecting liquids below the soil surface. Some use an inline tank with a foot tab that allows one to push the injector into the soil effectively. Some have a crank or lever, when pulled or pushed, delivers a set amount of liquid. Others are steel probes that can be hooked up to something that can be pressurized, like a hand can or backpack sprayer, or even a spray tank system. When the nozzle is pulled, liquid is injected into the soil. As with sprayers, many commercial landscape companies go big. Many of the tank truck systems can also be rigged to hook up to a soil injection system. While many of these are used to apply liquid fertilizer below the turf line or below the mulch, they are also effective for delivering root-absorbed systemic insecticides. Some of the water-soluble insecticides have labels that allow for trunk sprays to be made. These trunk sprays will penetrate the bark and get into the vascular bundles and then be transported up the tree to all of the branches and leaves. Even thicker bark trees seem to respond to this kind of treatment. Apparently, there is sufficient insecticide mix to get into the bark crevices where the tissues are thin enough for the insecticide to get into the vascular system. My favorite technique for applying many tree and shrub systemic insecticides is simply to pour the mix around the base of the tree. Most trees and shrubs have dense feeder roots right at the root flare. The technique is as simple as pulling back any mulch to expose the first small roots. Mix up the correct amount of insecticide, usually based on the tree circumference or diameter, then pour this around the tree base. Can't be any simpler. My only caution is to pay close attention to the labels that allow drenching. Many have a higher rate that should be applied to larger trees. Larger trees basically have more vascular tissues per their unit diameter, and more insecticide is needed to protect all of these tissues.